chapter 2 of a book called Flannery and Regina, the Andalusia Chronicles. Regina was keeping careful accounts. Every penny spent on the farm was recorded. Every penny made in profits was written down. 1952 was the most ambitious year of Flannery's tenure at Andalusia. Income reached over $24,000. But even at that, the farm ran at a loss. Regina maintained an account at the Exchange Bank in Milledgeville, where bills were paid and deposits were made by check. Her farming practices were remarkably similar from year to year. Eatonville Creamery received milk several times each week. It, in turn, provided feed for the herd, and the balance was deposited in the bank. Out of the surplus, Regina paid wages. She had between 13 and 27 employees in the 50s and 60s. She had decided to breed her own cattle. The breeding cost money. She had decided to grow her own feed. That, in turn, required seed and fertilizer. The truck needed gas and replacement parts. The farm needed a new well. The barn needed a new water heater. There were fence posts and barbed wire to buy. Regina took out farm insurance, and she set aside money for Social Security payments. When she could, she sold calves, roan heifers, ponies, and hay. Her supplies, aside from those she got from the Eatonville Creamery, came from the Cordon Farm Supply and the Harrington Milling Company. Lewis also brought her things from the King's Hardware store where he worked in Atlanta. Other than that, he stayed out of the way. He was, according to Sally Fitzgerald, a docile brother, allowing Regina to have her way, since, as he said to her, "You're gonna do just what you please anyway." She ran a tight ship. Whatever penuriousness Flannery had came from Regina's example. She, like her mother, kept track of every penny spent, and Regina charged her for everything at the farm. Room, board, postage, books, typewriter ribbons, shoes, gloves had to be paid back, even if they were only a couple dollars. And when Regina sewed for her, she charged her a fee. In 1959, for example, a new dress cost Flannery $9.55. Monies to Regina were counted out check by meager check. If her Uncle Lewis brought her Midroll, that's her steroid, from Atlanta, he had to be paid as well. Time and again, she wrote to friends about what she could earn by her writing. When the Kenyon Review gave her a $2,000 fellowship at the end of '52, Regina could finally brag. "Money talks," she said, "and the name of Rockefeller don't hurt a bit." Flannery knew that the money would go to her own medical needs for blood transfusions and steroids, but it was a godsend. She thought wistfully about funding a research trip to California, but quickly decided against it. Anxiety about money was always a backdrop to writing, a nagging worry that made her live from one royalty statement to the next. She would write to Elizabeth McKee many times, asking where the balance sheet would come out and expressing relief when the sales were good. Richard Gilman recorded Regina's obsession with sales figure. One evening at dinner, she said to me, while Flannery stared at her food in embarrassment. Now I want you to tell me what's wrong with those publishers up there in New York. Do you know how many copies of Mary Flannery's novel have been sold? 3,278. That's how many copies. And there's something very wrong with that. They are not doing right by her. I said that Forrest Strauss was a fine publisher, and that The Violet Bear Away wasn't the kind of novel likely to have a big sale. And then I added that Flannery's reputation was more and more secure, and that was the most important thing. Important thing, she snorted. Reputations don't buy groceries. Her Uncle Louis entered the fray on the side of the Kleins. In his view, writing was a matter of business finesse. His niece did not write about nice people because she wrote what paid. With regard to her initially meager sales, Flannery said simply, "I'm glad the statement was no worse." Imagine her satisfaction when Robert Giroux wrote that the New American Library had bid $4,000 for reprinting Wise Blood, and further relief when the Kenyon Review renewed its fellowship in 1954. That year, she also earned $46 for permissions for Enoch and the Gorilla, and $427 in royalties for Wise Blood. Given that profits for Andalusia had totaled a loss of $163 in '52, these were significant earnings. On sparse, notable occasions, Regina attempted to enter the literary world that claimed her daughter's deepening allegiance. These exchanges were reported with humor, but they cloaked a tremendous divide. Regina's work interested Flannery, but the interest was one-sided, the mark of interior lives that diverged with increasing and haunting dimension. My mama and I have been having interesting literary discussions, like the following, which took place over some modern library books I have just ordered. She: Moby Dick, I've always heard about that. Me: Moby Dick. She: Moby Dick, the idiot. You would get something called Idiot. What's it about? Me: an idiot. That summer, Regina told Flannery that Shakespeare was an Irishman. It had been reported in the Savannah paper. When Flannery doubted it, her mother said, "Listen, she didn't care whether he was an Irishman or a Chinaman. She's getting ready to build herself a pond for the cows to lie down in and cool off in the summertime. The government says it has to go down 2 feet straight to keep from breeding mosquitoes, but she don't want it that way for fear the cows will break their legs getting in." By April of '53, the work was finally completed. To the Fitzgeralds, Flannery wrote, "The Easter Bunny brought her a man with a bulldozer, so she's just finished her pond. She says she's not going to have but 4 feet of water in it, because if anybody drowns, she wants to be able to go in and get him out without draining it. Practical." During this time, Flannery was exploring another economy quite apart from Regina's concern about finance and property. She was paying attention to fiction as a world of unreal estate, a place where spiritual values could countermand the material world that claimed so much of her mother's time and energy. The power of intangible property claimed her imagination. Indeed, it drove her constantly to seek what lies within, but also beyond the concrete. While Regina struggled with her herds, Flannery mused on imaginary beasts and dragons. What were they? How did they manifest themselves? How could the given world point beyond itself to mortal dilemma? She used a quote from St. Cyril of Jerusalem to identify this project. The dragon sits by the side of the road, watching those who pass. Beware lest he devour you. We go to the Father of souls, but it is necessary to pass by the dragon. She continued by saying, no matter what form the dragon may take, it is of this mysterious passage past him or into his jaws that stories of any depth will always be concerned to tell. And this being the case, it requires considerable courage in any time, in any country, not to turn away from the storyteller. A major question for her was how to turn the attributes of Andalusia into the vehicle of this mysterious passage. How could it be a landscape both familiar and strange, both concrete and ineffable? Like Nabokov, whose memoirs speak memory, evoke the lost world of childhood, turning real loss into artistic gain, Flannery eludes the countryside, only to transform it into a wild, creative pasture, a world where the ordinary implements of living, the stuff of her mother's world, could assume the role of dragons, turning tractors and barbed wire and mowing machines into the vehicles of mortal danger. Her first Andalusia stories, the stories written in the early 50s, all create journeys away from sad, beleaguered homes. Andalusia's southern rural face appears fleetingly as a front porch where a mother and daughter sit in rocking chairs. But by and large, country life does not focus her narratives. For Flannery, the threat to well-being is initially figured in travel. The dangers to the self are literally by the side of the road on the way out of town. Leaving, going away, the hazards of the pathway are what distress. In the river, a young boy sifts through the cigarette butts and unfinished drinks of derelict parents, finding no place for himself. Home is not home. He is neglected, or as Flannery puts it, he doesn't count. The woman hired to take him away watches him and takes him to a healing, a kind of fundamentalist come-to-Jesus event. On the way, Harry Bevel observes, "You found out more when you left where you lived." Mrs. Conan and the boy walk on a highway, then on a dirt road, then across a field. When they enter a forest, the narrator says, he had never been in woods before, and he walked carefully, looking from side to side, as if he were entering a strange country. The metamorphosis of the landscape has begun, and it expands to include a broad orange stream where the reflection of the sun was set like a diamond. The preacher in the story provides the meaning of this circumstance. There ain't but one river, and that's the river of life. You can lay down your pain in that river and get rid of it. Caught between a thankless home and a new vision of spiritual possibility, the Yes, the child said, and thought, I won't go back to that apartment. I'll go under the river. This is Flannery's early formulation of life's potential. It records the pull of the sacred, but at the expense of the familiar. It configures the home provided by material circumstances as something to be left behind and rediscovered in the natural world. It imagines the river as solace for what is lacking in family life. Depending on reader's belief system, the river either kills the child or saves him. It is either a dragon which devours him or the vehicle of divine intervention. But in either case, the child has passed by mortal danger on his journey. In this story, we see Flannery weighing where to go. She locates home as some place to be abandoned in order for the life of the spirit to take hold. In it, we can glimpse the ambivalence of her own homecoming, the inadequacy of the farm's material world as an answer to the deeper questions posed by her illness. Andalusia shared none of the urban dereliction of Harry's domestic life, but it steeped her mother in a steady preoccupation with material circumstances, and these, for the daughter, failed to suffice. In a similar way, The Life You Save May Be Your Own takes account of human life in relation to materialism, this time practiced by a mother and a hired man. Flannery notably moves her story to the country, to a house which, like her own, has a porch with rocking chairs, and which required constant maintenance. However hospitable the porch, it is not an adequate home for the young woman, Lucy Nell Crater. Lacking help, the mother bargains her mute daughter's future for a handyman's presence on the farm, a bargain that ultimately fails. After the deal has been struck, the money paid, the worth the daughter agreed to, Mr. Shiflett abandons the girl by the side of the road, becoming himself the dragon that Lucy Nell must pass, or in this case, fail to pass. This story is the Flannery's first attempt to confront the issues of money and land management directly. Shiflett told the old woman then that all most people were interested in was money. The mother argues, but she argues from the position of ownership. She has cash, she has a child who can be bartered, she has a farm. In fact, she watches the world, quote, as if she were the owner of the sun. From the moment of Shiflett's arrival, she manages to win his labor for free, trading food, the back seat of a car, and the life of her daughter for farm repairs. Material benefit motivates both characters, but their negotiations are cloaked by lies. The mother lies about her daughter's age, her disability, and the gains to be had by marriage. Shiflett lies about his own goals, which are broadly to acquire a car and some cash. Instead, he insisted he was not interested in her money and settles for less cash than he had hoped, all in the service of taking the mute girl for a honeymoon that will never happen. Where Harry Bevel had left an inadequate home in search of the sacred, Lucy Nell Crater leaves an inadequate home for further abandonment. there is no river to save her. Flannery only alludes to divine intervention through the landscape, as if the wrath of God could be configured in a cloud the exact color of a hat and shaped like a turnip, descending on the racing car. Once again, the natural world transforms into something in excess of itself, its shape and action suggesting more than rain, the land itself reaping vengeance on the filth of human transaction. Clearly, Flannery was moving the locus of her stories to the mysteries contained in farm life, its insistent need for workers, its dependence on ready cash, its predictable collapse, and indeed its potential for corruption. There was the land, and there were those who tended the land, neither one to be mistaken for the other. At this early point, it is enough to notice that what is spiritual is associated with nature, that Flannery's unreal estate, her commitment to the intangible and sacred, is figured in the created world before it is farmed, before it is given into human oversight and care. Rivers and rainfall carry the weight and perspective of the divine. The Father of souls speaks through them. It was Regina's opinion that Flannery could accomplish this because of her efforts. I did everything else so that Flannery could write, she said, as she kept up with managing personnel, paying wages, overseeing crop rotation, and otherwise dealing with issues of ownership and trespass. Annie Bell Williams would get around $12.50 a month. Robert Hill, $20 a month. Willie Manson, $12. Louise Hill and Guy Stevens were her highest paid employees at approximately $45. Wages tended to total around $200 a month. Regina's records don't register any hourly rates, so it is impossible to gauge if her wages were mean, generous, or in line with other dairy farms. In August of '53, Flannery reported that her mother was expecting a new farm family whose last name was Matsiak. Brad Gooch, who interviewed Jan Matsiak's son, described him as Polish, a refugee from World War II, and from a labor farm. Once their U.S. visas were approved, the family moved to Gray and traveled 20 miles each Sunday to attend the Sacred Heart Catholic Church in Milledgeville. This is where Regina met them. She moved them into a 4-room shack beyond the lower pond with no running water and a wood-burning stove. For Regina, the father was a godsend. He was industrious and knowledgeable, exactly the kind of help she thought she deserved. For Flannery, he provided the occasion to examine the tensions between home and exile, to ask who belongs on the property and how to manage those who make a claim to it. Land ownership came with power. Power demanded management. Management implied hierarchy. The displaced person confronts the foundational assumptions of Andalusia as a business enterprise. Regina never questioned the order of the world she inherited from her brother. There was the big house, the house for the main farm family, and various other outlying structures for lesser hired help. The very architecture of Andalusia announced its priorities. That the Matsiaks were housed beyond the pond tells us Regina's initial way of evaluating immigrants on her property. They were poor, dependent, and replaceable. In Flannery's story, the arrival of the immigrants initiates a struggle for placement in that hierarchy. And it also reverses the trajectory of danger in her imagination. Where her first Andalusia stories located threat on the road, in travel, in going out away from home, the dragon could be anywhere. The displaced person brings unrest back to that home, placing mortal conflict on the farm itself. Issues of life and death and of contested human value will be confronted in familiar fields and between the back door and the barn. Brad Gruch has pointed out that Flannery called specific language from Regina and Mrs. Parnham, her dairyman's wife, as they anticipated the arrival of new people from Europe. Quote, "They've been making curtains for the windows out of flour chicken feed sacks. Regina was complaining that the green sacks wouldn't look so good in the same room with the pink ones. And Mrs. Parnham says in a very superior voice, 'Do you think they'll even know what colors is?'" This is funny and it is pathetic, but the dialogue discloses the order of the world. With stereotypical images of post-war life in Europe, with preconceptions of devastation gleaned from the mass media, Mrs. Shortley first says, "They ain't where they was born at," and adds, "Think how lucky they are to escape from over there and come to a place like this." She sees neither the geopolitics informing war nor the individual suffering following from it. She only remembers something on the TV. And then she moves to a grossly ignorant misapprehension. Mrs. Shortley had the sudden intuition that the gobblehooks, like rats with typhoid fleas, could have carried all those murderous ways over the water and with them directly to this place. Far from contaminating the farm, the Gisaks quickly make a place for themselves. From being geographically dislocated, they move through diligence to being persons of great value to Mrs. McIntyre. She measures human worth by its use value. Flannery gives glimpses of another form of measurement in details from the Gisaks' past. The daughter reveals that they had lived in a big brick house until people took them away from it. And Mr. Gisak begins to mention the death camps they had survived. The family has known a higher status than Mrs. McIntyre gives them in their shack without water, and it has known suffering of a kind that is unimaginable to their host. She sees them only as a financial asset and arranges the farm's implicit hierarchy. Where once she had valued her help in racial terms, white superseding black workers with foreigners somewhere out in left field, she comes to rate the foreigners best. A hardworking, motivated intruder becomes of more worth to her than Mr. Shortley's dilatory negligence. Then she makes an extraordinary move. She names Mr. Gisak as her savior. "That man is my salvation," she said. This is, of course, an economic calculation, but has civic consequences that reach far beyond financial profit. The Shortleys, learning of their imminent ouster, arranged to leave before being humiliated. The location of danger has been reversed, and with it, the position of refugee. A culturally entrenched family goes on the road, now seeking a different kind of safety for themselves. But their flight is disastrous. In fact, it is described in terms that we recognize from Mrs. Shortley's evaluation of the suffering of Jews in Europe. Quote, she thrashed forward and backward, clutching at everything. Mr. Shortley's head, Sarah May's leg, the cat, a wad of white bedding, her own big moon-like knee. Then she dies, thrust out of all familiar geographic markers, into an unknown and unanticipated dimension. On the farm, the shelter seemingly offered to the Gizaks is disrupted by their violation of a social code. They want to marry a cousin to one of the black farm workers. Mrs. McIntyre is so affronted that she forsakes all economic prudence. Indeed, she forsakes her humanity in defense of a racism so deep that it appears unassailable. There is, as it turns out, a border crossing that Mrs. McIntyre cannot assimilate, a place where the foreign remains too foreign, a line that cannot be crossed, a boundary too impermeable for money to allay or greed to mollify. Mr. Gizak turns out to be a savior with the wrong message. She responds to him by reminding him that she is sovereign. I don't want to have to speak to you about this again. If I do, you'll have to find another place for yourself. This is my place, and I say who will come here and who won't. She aims to draw her own line and to compel obedience, and she sees no reason to do otherwise. Looking at him as through a gun sight, she observes, all her life she's been fighting the world's overflow, and now she had it in the form of a pole. We cannot say that Mrs. McIntyre plots the demise of her hired help, but she does nothing to prevent Mr. Gizak's death. Crushing him, as Mr. Shortley does with an unmoored tractor, relieves her of the responsibility to give the refugee 30 days' notice, or indeed to continue to give him work and a home. But it thrusts her into a foreign world. Having resisted the priest's admonition to shelter the Polish family, think of the thousands of them. Think of the ovens and the boxcars and the camps and the sick children and Christ our Lord. She thinks only of herself. He's extra and he upset the balance around here. In the end, what is upset is her own balance. Quote, she felt she was in some foreign country where people bent over the body were natives, and she watched like a stranger while the dead man was carried away in the ambulance. In addressing the issue of who belongs on the land, Flannery was implicitly questioning the social system of Andalusia. While the actual mother and daughter went placidly to Mass and to lunch each day, giving the impression of unalloyed camaraderie, Flannery, in her writing, was undermining Regina's assumptions about the hierarchy that she both established and upheld as the natural order of farm life. Flannery's quiet compatibility, her properly filial demeanor cloaked a silent rebuke. The daughter saw the exclusiveness, the unholy superiority of her mother's management style. She saw the control and condescension extended to landless tenants, blacks, and refugees. The confrontation that she avoided in person became, in fiction, a pointed critique, a reminder that ownership of property is not a guarantee of righteousness, but only of power, and power bought ultimately at personal expense. Her characters say, "It's the people that run away from where they come from that I got no use for." Her implotment of danger reveals the fragility of such views. The dairyman's wife is dead, the farm owner has collapsed, both are displaced, the farm itself become a place of exile. The displaced person was Flannery's first extended reflection on the environment to which illness had brought her. It was savage in rendering Mrs. McIntyre's constant lament. Her character takes endless pity on herself. "I've been running this place for 30 years and always just barely making it. People think you're made of money. I have taxes to pay. I have the insurance to keep up. I have the repair bills. I have the feed bills." In depiction of farm women in O'Connor's short kitchen, Monica Miller is right to remind us that the problems facing women who ventured into agribusiness were real. She is right to call attention to the financial and emotional stress that came with trying to hold a small town together in the mid-century South. But Flannery countered these complaints with an alternate perspective. She remained equally committed to unreal estate, to the power of the intangible, and to the fictional strategy of using landscape as a vehicle of the sacred. The writer, she said, operates at a peculiar crossroads where time and place and eternity somehow meet. His problem is to find that location. She was making distinctions. She was beginning to understand how to see the various dimensions of life at Andalusia. Flannery was not done with her exploration of the meaning of property. In the mid-1950s, she looked again at farmland, this time from the perspective of trespass, exploring the tension between ownership and transgression, and between proper management and contamination. She reminds us, we are sustained in our writing by the local, the particular, and the familiar. Clearly open fields, lines of trees, farm machinery, and barns constitute what is familiar to her. But she once again asks how to manage these assets. It is not simply that rural life inhabits her fiction, but that the very contours of inhabiting property give force and distinction to her vision. A Circle in the Fire was written in 1954. It's in a collection called A Good Man is Hard to Find, and it creates a Georgia countryside that is not only a setting, but a map of property's fate. The story is a kind of lexicon of possible attitudes toward ownership. Taken for granted and experienced as a burden, Mrs. Cope's farm surrounds her with rich pasture and hills heavy with timber. For her, responsibility explains and justifies her own well-being. She presides over her estate as one presides over a hereditary kingdom, with her own superiority as the precondition and culmination of a natural order. The subsequent events in the narrative will challenge the economic, aesthetic, and political underpinnings of her unstated assumptions, transforming the wild fields of her hubris into an utterly strange and desolate landscape. Farming in these fictional circumstances is a matter, once again, of presiding over a hierarchy. It includes various levels of hired hope. While Mrs. Cope offers prayers of thanksgiving for all she has, her farm worker, Mrs. Pritchard, remarks, "All I got is 4 abscessed teeth." While she pulls at the nut grass, priding herself at the land's upkeep, she thinks of her Negroes as destructive and impersonal as the weeds. The politics of poverty never enter her mind. That the land is arbitrarily distributed is beyond imagination. To her, people are simply resources that cannot be trusted, and hence they threaten continually to encroach or to step out of place. For Mrs. Cope, plot, both her land and her strategy of action, is predicated on the observable natural world, being hers and hers alone. Before the displaced youth who set fire to the woods arrive, Flannery articulates the resentment created by inequality and shows it to undermine the social structure she represents. Mrs. Pritchard grumbles, but she accepts the hierarchy of which she is a part. The young men who arrive from the suburbs do not accept it. They begin to subvert the natural procedures on Mrs. Cope's farm. They eat her food, they ride her animals, they smoke cigarettes. They refuse to be contained in the underprivileged roles that Mrs. Cope has designated for them and that she explores as God-given. Their place in the social world comes into focus in the natural world, where one boy thinks that he and his friends are trespassing, treading on what is not theirs, and another boy makes the claim that nature cannot be owned at all. "She don't own them woods," said Hollis. "She does too." And that their little one said, "Man, God owns them woods and her too." And that their one with the glasses said, "I reckon she owns the sky over this place too." Through this opposition of ownership and delinquency, O'Connor demonstrates the danger of marginality and neglect. She shows that failure at the level of the social world is what causes disasters in nature. The boys burn the woods because it is the only way they have to call attention to the damage wrought by their own prior exclusion. Throughout their struggle, the woods stand impassive, the object of action and attitudes, but never known beyond their blue-gray silence. A circle in the fire shows human alienation to be complete, bridged neither by proprietary care, pulling out the nutgrass, nor by disregard. The trees remain a brooding presence which provoke action, but they never become a presence to be known or simply respected. "Her woods," said the large boy, and then he burns them down. We could say then that O'Connor's narrative examines these counterclaims of ownership. It, the place, don't belong to nobody. It's ours, the little boy said. With the perspective of law and custom, no counterclaims exist. The farm belongs to Mrs. Cope, and the boys are trespassing. But Flannery makes a quiet, stunning reversal by borrowing a metaphor from the book of Daniel. The boys shriek, quote, as if the prophets were dancing in the fiery furnace, in the circle the angel had cleared for them. That is, Flannery identifies the boys with the divine, casting them as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who refused to worship the golden image of Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. Quote from the Bible, King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand, and we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up. Like the prophets in the biblical stories, the boys repudiate an image of gold. They refuse Mrs. Cope's God of entitlement, asserting an alternative to her property claims, surviving the fire, and indeed thriving in its aftermath. With this illusion, Flannery turns her narrative from the singular to the collective, affecting a critique of possessive individualism as the basis of civic society. With this metaphoric association, she achieves a radical realignment of value, suggesting that land can be owned by working it, by remembering it, by living on it as Powell once had. It exists in memory and in imagination, making intangible claims that haunt the ground with as much force as Mrs. Cope's anxious, self-satisfied propriety. This is a remarkable literary turn, for it recognizes the implicit claim of the masses lying disruptively within the singularity of a legal deed. It marks the geography of Flannery's fiction as both familiar and uncanny. It tells us she has found a way to operate at peculiar crossroads where time and place and eternity somehow meet. In eternity, the earth belongs equally to all. Short of eternity, there are the private estates of people like Mrs. Cope. Here, for a narrative moment, that estate is claimed by divinity. Encroachment is turned into virtue, and ownership collapses into a dubious claim, bounded not by human law, but by cosmic perspective. There are neither owners nor trespassers, for even the resources through which the boys express their dispossession are owned by someone else. To poach on land is to challenge the very idea of enclosure itself, and with it the false binarisms that ensue from those boundaries. Property underlies Mrs. Cope's superiority to others, her denegation of those whose work ensures her prosperity, her sense of blessed exceptionalism. All of these preconceptions fail in this fictional universe. Mrs. Cope is leveled. Quote, the child came to a stop beside her mother and stared up at her face as if she had never seen it before. It was the face of the new misery she felt, but on her mother it looked old and it looked as if it might have belonged to anybody, to a Negro, to a European, or to Powell himself. In Flannery's fictional universe, there is no estate to be passed down, even though the next generation is represented in narrative by a dour but curious child. The estate is destroyed. Instead, property is replaced with insight. The land itself does not bestow privilege, and the privileges erroneously claimed by ownership do not endure. It takes a conflagration to hit Mrs. Cope with the concept of common humanity, common empathy, and the imperative to tend the earth collectively. It is only by loss that she experiences a kinship with the boys who threaten her. They are, unwittingly, instruments of extreme change. They are, in other language, the dragons of Flannery's imagination, brought home to the farm. This is the last section. Regina went on, seemingly oblivious to her daughters in her life. Without reading Flannery's work, without seeing its depth of perception, she judged only by what she saw. When Flannery was invited to speak to the Macon Women's Club, Regina approved. "My mother thinks this is very fine," Flannery reported to the Fitzgeralds, "and likely to broaden me. She finds me very narrow in my outlook." That narrow outlook and the friction it caused became the focus of still another story. A few years earlier, on the eve of the '52 presidential election, Flannery had observed, "My mama and I are on the way to the polls to cancel out each other's vote." She understood that they canceled each other out in more ways than one. The opposition inherent in their viewpoints was clear to her, and it became the subject of Good Country People. On Flannery's fictional farm, language itself functions as a social marker, a way of indicating the relationship of one social class to another, and also a way of addressing the miscommunication between one generation and another. The farm becomes a microcosm of a larger but still stratified world, a world that cloaks social distinction in trivia. Flannery's farm workers communicate in platitudes, cliches, and gossip. Their speech acts as a bridge between their different stations in life. The farm owner, Mrs. Hopewell, and the wife of the farm help, Mrs. Freeman, speak in ways that the grown daughter finds inane. "Nothing is perfect. Life is like that. It takes all kinds to make the world. I always said it myself." The girls was used to this kind of dialogue for breakfast and more of it for dinner, and sometimes they had it for supper too. Idle talk superficially dispels the distinctions of class between two unequal women. They are united in their banality. But it is at the same time what separates the daughter, Joy Hulda, from them. Her constant anger arises from her perception of her own special kind of superiority. She is an educated woman, and it has not escaped her notice that her mother pities her for her achievement, and that ignorant banter trumps intelligence in their household. Mrs. Hopewell also greets her child with constant admonition. "If you can't come pleasantly, I don't want you at all. There is nothing wrong with your face that a pleasant expression wouldn't help. In turn, the daughter's language is experienced by the mother as, quote, gibberish. Into this contested space comes a Bible salesman who is categorized like Mrs. Freeman as good country people, a phrase that is meant to assign stature and to distinguish between acceptable people and trash. He fools them all. Mrs. Hopewell remains clueless, but Joy Holga is really flummoxed. He beats her at her own game of seduction, stealing her wooden leg, and with it her sense of dour superiority. She is reduced to her mother's level of banality. Aren't you just good country people? A circumstance that in no way lifts the tension between classes of people and between generations. That the world of her imagination was striated, built from class distinction, littered with cliché, is a mark of Andalusia's structure, a reflection of its social life, and equally, notably, Flannery's critique of its human dynamic. In his life of O'Connor, Glad Grucius attributed good country people to Flannery's brief, involved, and yet ultimately discordant relationship with Eric Langshar, a 26-year-old textbook salesman for Harvard Grace. Was a Princeton grad, the son of a Danish diplomat and a Russian immigrant mother who had divorced when he was young. He had taught briefly at Fordham University. When his Catholic ambivalence no longer seemed a good fit, he had become a publisher's rep, cosmopolitan in a way that Regina could never be. He offered Flannery companionship, conversation, and an outsider's understanding of Catholic theology. They spoke about Dorothy Day. He told her that he did not understand Day, and they shared their personal stories. To Flannery, he said, I'd come to the U.S., that I was now traveling somewhat rootlessly in the South, that I had all these religious concerns and problems. She identified with his homelessness. You wonder how anybody can be happy in his home as long as there is one person without one. I never thought of this so much until I began to know you and your situation, and I will never quite have a home again on account of it. They laughed over the fact that his promotional materials were called Bible. It is obvious that Flannery used his unexpected arrival at the farm as the occasion to write about a fictional figure also arriving with a false Bible. But we can see something else in Flannery's imaginative transformation of events at Andalusia. The daughter figure courts her own catastrophe in the story because she is not at home, because she desires conversation aside from the inanities of the older generation of women, and because she has a sense, mistaken though it is, that somewhere in the world is a kindred spirit, a match. Mrs. Hopewell wonders what the two of them could possibly discuss, without understanding that her own version of conversation is itself the impetus for Joy Holga's ill-fated liaison. The mother's back-fence platitudes with Mrs. Freeman provide as much a motive for Joy Holga's attempted seduction as intellectual pride. Both things, desire, escape, and pride, lead to the narrative's catastrophe. And the catastrophe, the suitor making off with Joy Holga's most precious thing, lets us see that the story is equally about loneliness at the heart of home life and the desire to have a companion. During these early years at Andalusia, while Regina kept accounts, Flannery took account of what lay before her. She examined the allure of property, the status sought by land ownership, the threats to sovereignty posed by intruders, the pitfalls of individual possessiveness. She heard the narrow-minded gossip of local holy rollers. The consequence of these reflections was, ironically, an admission of homelessness that she shared with Eric Langshard. And here I'm repeating. I never thought so much of this until I began to know you and your situation, and I will never quite have a home again on account of it. Andalusia provided shelter and interest, but it also carried with it the shades of exile. Real estate would not seduce Flannery as it had her mother. While Regina remained firmly grounded in the material world, owning it, managing it, deriding it, being exasperated by it, Flannery turned it into cosmic enterprise. Her imagination played over the sacred implications of what she witnessed, and often she did not find it. She would look for a home elsewhere.